It's a red flag if a woman says she has a narcissistic ex. This is what Dr. Orion Taraban has to say, and we're going to break down one of his videos that he made just the other day. And to me, there's a lot of black and white thinking in this video, and it's a pretty shallow take of what happens in these kinds of relationships. And it's almost as if he doesn't understand what a trauma bond is. And to me, he says some things that have some truth in it, but then other things, it's just a pretty big generalization. And overall, I think Orion says some smart things in other videos, but this video was fairly disappointing. But let's jump into it here.
Narcissistic ex. So it seems like in today's day and age, every woman has a narcissistic ex-boyfriend or a narcissistic ex-husband.
Yes, there are many women who do say this, and often it's true, but let's hear what he says.
And that's amazing because the most recent epidemiological data I could find suggests that between 1% to 2% of Americans have NPD, or narcissistic personality disorder. And that number includes female narcissists.
So first of all, we must make a distinction between narcissistic and narcissistic personality disorder. To me, narcissistic is someone that might not meet all of the criteria for NPD. They could still be on the spectrum of narcissism, though. They can still be exploitative, have a grandiose sense of self, and be impaired in the empathy department. They just don't have NPD. Also, to mention, you don't need to have full-blown NPD to absolutely be abusive. The labels in these things do not matter nearly as much as how you are being treated. It doesn't matter what their label is if they're being abusive. And then lastly with this, the estimates for NPD can be as high as 5 to 6% of the population, if not more. And as Chelsea Brooke Cole, who's an LPC, I interviewed her before, that is 20 million people in America with NPD, if it's 5 to 6%. And if you take a look at that 5 to 6% and that 20 million people, as a conservative estimate, if each one of them has impacted 5 people in their lives, that's 100 million people impacted. But also, let's face it too, it is really difficult to know how many narcissists there truly are because most don't get diagnosed. But to say it's 1 to 2%, that's a pretty low estimate if you ask me. Also, narcissistic, different than full-blown NPD, and that distinction doesn't matter anyway. Abuse is what really matters. Are they being abusive? Are they putting you through the cycle of abuse? That's the part that matters. And again, this guy is a licensed professional. I think he should know better than to say some of this.
So it's pretty hard to imagine that 2% of the men have dated like 100% of the women. So what's going on here?
And that's another silly way to put it too, because if there's, first of all, 5 to 6% of the population, that's a lot of men. And it's also a lot of women. They're also realizing there's a lot of women that have NPD as well. It used to be considered more of a man's disorder, and borderline was considered more of a women's disorder, but they're realizing it's more equal than they thought. But it's also true to say that a lot of narcissistic guys are absolutely in a lot of different relationships. That is true too. I don't even think that's outlandish to say.
Certainly, part of the issue is that the popular imagination has significantly expanded the definition of narcissism in recent years. It's more commonly used for its, let's say, moral connotations than for its descriptive purposes. Narcissist has functionally become shorthand for an exploitative person who doesn't care about the feelings of others. That said, any woman who feels that she gave more than she received in return could potentially reframe that experience as exploitative.
So let's go over first. What even is a narcissist? A narcissist is someone that has a grandiose sense of self and they feel superior. They lack empathy. They can be hypersensitive to criticism. They can be exploitative. They have fantasies of power, brilliance, or success, and they can have a sense of entitlement. Often, They are absolutely abusive people. And it's like I always say, anything a narcissist does, it's about power, control, image, narcissistic supply, and avoiding accountability. But you can boil all of that down to getting what they want. And a lot of it's control. But to boil it down to just being exploitative and taking more than they receive, I don't think that's even what people mean when they say narcissistic anyway. When women are saying this, and when men say this in relationships with female narcissists, that's not what they mean. What they mean is this person is allergic to accountability, plays the victim, flips the script, is constantly using methods like Darvo, deny, accuse, reverse victim, and offender. They are always finding things you have done wrong. You're always guilty of something. They cycle you through the stages of abuse, love bombing, devalue, discard, and they do intermittent rewards, which makes it also more addicting. But that's the cycle of abuse. It is a lot more than just saying exploitative and taking more than they receive. So I don't even like his framing of it here either.
And in any relationship, one person always has to give more, and one person always has to take more. Like, it's impossible for the giving and the taking to be perfectly balanced.
Now, I will slightly agree with that. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfectly even 50-50. It can get close to that, but usually it's not going to be that. I do agree with that.
And in my conceptualization, it's the adorer who gives more and feels more, and the adored who takes more and feels less. This means that, given its widespread usage and connotation, a woman is much more likely to retroactively believe any man who occupied the role of the adored in a previous relationship to be narcissistic.
So, to reiterate what he's saying here, what he means is if the woman has cared more about the man than the man has cared about her, that woman is going to be more likely to consider that man narcissistic. And to me, that is a shallow take because, again, what did I say narcissistic was? What did I say a narcissist is like? That is not really what it's like. There is a difference between someone who is an a-hole and someone that is a narcissist or even narcissistic. But granted, almost all narcissists will also be a-holes. It's one of those things where not all a-holes are narcissists, but all narcissists are absolutely a-holes. But I don't think this direction of what he's saying here is relevant.
But it would be wrong to simply take her description at face value and concur that the ex in question had a personality disorder, especially because he was only the adored by virtue of her adoration.
And again, it doesn't matter if he had a personality disorder or not, or if the woman has a personality disorder or not. The behaviors are what matters. Are they being abusive? Are they disrespecting you? Are they treating you poorly? That's what matters much more than this label. And the focusing on, oh, this percentage of narcissists in the population, that's the wrong thing to focus on. That part doesn't matter, whether it's 2%, 6%. Are these people abusing others? That's what matters. Can you put someone through the cycle of abuse without being a narcissist with full-blown NPD? Absolutely you can. They can just be a lower end on the scale narcissist. And you better believe, I talked to Dr. Salerno about this, there are less severe narcissists that don't qualify for full-blown NPD, but they're still absolutely narcissists.
In any case, it's a pretty bad sign when a woman complains about having a narcissistic ex for a number of reasons. First and foremost, if her name calling is designed to give the impression that her previous relationship failed simply due to the malevolence of her ex, then on some level, that woman is abnegating any responsibility for the dissolution of that relationship.
Pause. All it takes is one person's abuse to ruin a relationship. And also, more than one thing can be true at the same time. One, before someone is familiar with narcissism, borderline, the cycle of abuse, what love bombing looks like, this kind of thing can happen to anybody. And then once you're sucked in, and then you develop a trauma bond with this person, it's really difficult to leave. It's they have the intermittent rewards they're putting in there. That's when they go back and forth between love bombing and devaluing. It's the same reason why gambling is so addictive, but it's certainly not easy to get out of there once you're in it because the narcissistic people, abusive people, the people who use coercive control, gaslight you, constantly blame you for everything, that puts you through the ringer. And when you're through that, you're a shell of yourself once you're in that kind of scenario. And with what he's about to say coming up here, he's acting as if you're always just in a good mental framework, no matter what. And he doesn't take into consideration when you're in a trauma bond, you are not in a good place anymore. Like you've been sucked down by this person. And parts of what he'll say I'm going to agree with, but definitely not all. And I think this is absolutely a very simplistic take.
Which is very peculiar. It is very, very rare for any relationship problem to be entirely and exclusively one partner's fault.
One person can absolutely be more abusive than the other, and all it takes is one person to destroy a relationship. Now, does that mean the other person's perfect? No, it doesn't mean the other person's perfect because no one's perfect. But one person can absolutely be the major reason why the relationship fails.
Like who chose to enter into and remain in that relationship? Most likely, this narrative is a taste of things to come.
So he mentions remaining in the relationship. And again, if you're in a trauma bond, and this is the first time you've been in this circumstance, you don't know what's hit you. You don't understand narcissism. You don't know the cycle of abuse. It's not as easy just to leave when you don't know what it is. There are so many people that reach out to me and they become my coaching clients, etc. They've been in these kinds of relationships for decades and they just didn't know what it was. It's not nearly as clear and obvious as he's making it seem here.
Framing her past relationships in this light likely means that she is either an externalizer, that is, someone who believes that all her internal states are dictated by external stimuli, or a victim, that is, someone who believes that she is the innocent prey of oppressive or predatory forces.
And that's a pretty black and white way to see it as well. It is not that black and white.
Now, do predatory men exist? Absolutely, and they are scary. But they are not nearly as common as you might expect from listening to some of these stories.
What does that even mean, though? Not nearly as common. There's millions of people that do indeed have full-blown MPD, and we already mentioned that you don't need to have full-blown MPD to be abusive. And you better believe there's a fair amount of people that are doing that too. Not to mention the people that have just the dark triad or the dark tetrad, antisocial personality disorder. There's a lot of stuff going on here that it could be.
In any case, both possibilities are characterized by difficulties in assuming responsibility, tendencies toward categorical or black or white thinking, and poor insight and discernment. Not a great sign. But here's another reason why this kind of talk is concerning in a woman. To appreciate its significance, we need to understand the relationship between narcissistic personalities and borderline personalities. According to some of the epidemiological research I've read, which has been borne out by my clinical experience, narcissistic men are significantly more likely to have had a borderline mother compared with non-narcissistic men. And by the same token, borderline women are significantly more likely to have had a narcissistic father compared with non-borderline women.
Now, partially, I can see some of this, but this is way more of he's making it an environmental cause. Now, when I talk to Dr. Salerno, we talk about the inherent genetic traits that need to be there. And if there's inherent genetic traits, it's also then more likely that one of your parents then has these inherent genetic traits as well. Not definite, but definitely more likely. But I don't know about this avenue here. I do think that if you've had a narcissistic parent, or even a cluster B parent, that has conditioned people to associate the behaviors of a narcissist or borderline with love. It's the initial trauma bond, and people are going to try to chase the love of their narcissistic or borderline parent because the narcissistic parent in particular, they make people earn love and then they withhold love. And they also do the cycle of abuse with their kids. It just looks a little bit differently.
What does this mean? It means that to some extent, the two disorders tend to create each other.
And I don't think that's what's creating them. Again, for there to be a genetic component plus an environmental factor, not to mention if you have those inherent genetic traits, you are more likely to seek out the environments that would create it. And that's something that I read in Dr. Solano's book, The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism. But to say borderline creates narcissism, narcissism creates borderline, no, I do not think so. I think sometimes abusive behaviors can contribute, but that genetic component is pretty important as well.
Which is what has led some researchers to postulate that the two disorders are really just gendered expressions of the same underlying dysfunction.
And I don't agree with that part either, although I have interviewed people that have said things similar, but BPD is different than NPD, especially in the fact that borderlines will have the fear of abandonment and they want to merge with another person. Narcissists don't necessarily want to merge. They want to control, exploit, and use people as tools and objects. Borderlines, not so much. Borderlines, I think people, when you're in a relationship with them, it's a little more real than with a narcissist. But to say they are just gendered expressions of the same disorder, I don't agree with that. And there's female narcissists, just like there's male borderlines. Another reason why I don't agree with it.
In any case, let's explore why this might be the case. What would it be like to grow up with a borderline mother? Borderlines are often emotionally volatile with an unstable sense of self. They can be very manipulative, and they can transgress all kinds of boundaries when they are emotionally disequilibrated. Living with them can be chaotic, overwhelming, and crazy-making.
That's all true.
So, in order to survive in this environment, what some children do, kind of as a last-ditch attempt at self-preservation, is cut off conscious access to their emotions so they can't be used against them in parental manipulation, and turn off their empathy.
Now, I don't agree with this because I don't think this is a conscious choice by narcissists or borderlines. I think a lot of these inherent traits, they're there. And how much are you really choosing when you're between 2 to 6 years old, 2 to 8 years old? I don't really think you are. I don't think you're choosing. But he's saying that you are choosing, and this is more of your defense mechanism or adaptation. I don't necessarily agree with that.
So they don't get sucked into the drama that tends to circulate around these individuals. A softer-hearted child might end up consumed by the mother's emotionality and neediness. By taking certain parts of themselves offline, these children are able to survive in a very difficult emotional environment from which they can't escape, and to potentially launch independent lives further down the line. By the same token, let's examine what it might be like to grow up with a narcissistic father. Narcissists are often devoid of empathy and emotional warmth. Among other things, this would make it very difficult to feel cared for or loved or valued as a child. The child's feelings would often be ignored, and their talents either quashed or directed toward the glorification of the parent. Living with them can be infuriating, neglectful, and invalidating. So, in order to survive in this environment, what some children
Now, he's right about the description of what a narcissistic parent is like.
do, kind of as a last-ditch effort at self-preservation, is significantly amplify their emotions so they can no longer be ignored and act out in a number of ways so they won't be minimized into irrelevance.
And again, for the same thing, I disagree with his how people like adapt or defend against the borderline parent. I don't agree for the same reason in this, because I don't think it's that conscious of a choice. I don't think it's that they're doing it purposefully. I think there's more genetic factors involved, and it's not as consciously chosen at that age.
A better behaved child might end up erased by the father's grandiose neglect. By making certain parts of themselves so loud and unavoidable, these children are able to survive in a very difficult emotional environment from which they can't escape, and to potentially launch independent lives further down the line.
And that's just more of an environmental cause for personality disorders anyway. And that's not something I agree with as much. And Dr. Salerno and I, we go over it all the time. But that genetic component is a very important piece of the puzzle. But to say, he's basically saying your childhood is what creates a personality disorder. And that's something that Dr. Salerno and I, we talk about a lot. And does it contribute? Sure. But is it the main cause? I don't think so. The reason why I don't think it's the main cause is, why isn't everyone that has a narcissist or a borderline parent, why aren't they turning into the reciprocal? Because there's that genetic component that is also necessary. Because if this is all it took, then anyone who was abused, anyone who was mistreated and has childhood trauma, they would turn into a narcissist or a borderline. But this is not the case. And it's not the case because it is not the only piece of the puzzle.
If you're interested in taking your understanding to the next level, I would buy anywhere else. It's not a great look when women complain about their narcissistic exes. When they do that, they're basically confessing that there is an increased likelihood that they themselves are borderlines. Okay? It takes a little bit to noodle this out, but let's explore this from a couple of different angles. Healthy, securely attached women do not end up in relationships with narcissistic men. This is because when such a woman dates a narcissist, she tends to feel that something is off. Maybe she struggles to make an emotional connection with the man, or she's put off by his grandiosity or arrogance, or she understands that suddenly getting everything she's ever dreamed of is an act that can't possibly be true. These women might stick around for a while, especially if the man is charming and successful, but they eventually understand that something doesn't feel right and they bounce.
And this is also to misunderstand a little bit about what's going on here, especially when people are younger. They don't know this. They don't know that love bombing is a thing. Mirroring and matching someone's likes and dislikes are a thing. And once that's happened to you and you've gotten sucked in, and then all of a sudden the devaluing comes in, the belittling comes in, the put downs come in, the blaming you for everything comes in, the very controlling behavior comes in. At this point, it's not as cut and dry as he's making it seem to just bounce. It's like, no, once you're in that trauma bond, that's an awful place to be in. You've been abused and they've torn you down at this point. You might have had a good sense of self-worth to begin with, but then slowly but surely they hack at it and they chip it away. They wear it away like sandpaper. So it's not as easy as he's making it seem here.
They don't end up in 5-year relationships with a narcissist. They don't end up married to the narcissist for 20 years.
Not always true either. Again, if someone doesn't know, especially before the internet era, people have been involved in these kinds of relationships for years. He's saying, oh, if you were healthy, you would automatically just leave. Now, the part I will agree with is, once you do have the awareness and you do understand, and if you do consistently attract narcissistic people, that is something to take a look at. And to me, that's where I would say practicing radical self-respect will act as a guardrail to keep you out of those kinds of situations. And when we do that, it's impossible to stay. But before you know this stuff, it's not as he makes it seem. It's not that cut and dry.
At least not without assuming some accountability for the fact that they almost certainly were not healthy or securely attached when choosing to enter into and remain in said relationship. So a woman with no...
So he's saying, if you're even there to begin with, you're not healthy. And again, if you're aware of what's going on, you understand narcissism and you're choosing to be in it anyway, that's a different story. But what's happening in many of these other situations is someone doesn't know. They don't know. They've gotten sucked in, and then they're in the trauma bond. And then that wears away at their sense of self-worth. They've been abused, gaslit, told everything they think and feel is always wrong, and that does a number on people. So it's not like, oh, if you were healthy, you would just leave. In the perfect world, that might be the case, but that's just not how it works in a trauma bond.
Narcissistic exes is much more likely to be unhealthy or have attachment issues like borderlines. And of course, if a woman is a borderline, it would also make it much more likely that her exes were narcissists. This is because healthy, securely attached men do not end up in relationships with borderline women. Maybe he finds himself on the other end of one of her emotional outbursts, or he is once again harshly judged and intentionally misunderstood.
And again, this also assumes from the man's perspective that there's no other issues going on and he understands and has a good sense of self-worth to begin with. It's like, that's not always the case. Some people that are especially men, they don't have many options with women, so they're more likely to try to settle because they think it's better than nothing. That absolutely happens. There's guys that are on the spectrum. There's guys that have other mood disorders as well, that there's reasons why this can happen. It's not as cut and dry as, well, if you were just healthy, you wouldn't be there at all. Now, in my case, in my life today, if I were to wind up in a situation like that, it would be on me because I understand. I understand this stuff now. I understand narcissism. I understand the cycle of abuse. I understand borderlines. And once you've gotten to my place, yeah, then it would be on me if I wind up in a situation like that. But before I became aware, then I just didn't know what I didn't know. And that's what I constantly tell people that are beating themselves up in these kinds of situations. You didn't know what you didn't know. You didn't know what this stuff was like. You didn't know what a narcissist's behaviors were like and the cycle of abuse was like. You just didn't know. And because you didn't know, you got to give yourself a break.
Understood, or he spends another weekend trying to piece her together after a breakdown. These men might stick around for a while, especially if the woman is attractive and fucks him well. But they eventually understand that something doesn't feel right and they bounce.
And again, he's making it seem so easy, but once someone's in a trauma bond is an attachment you make to someone that is mistreating you. And even if you were healthy going in, slowly but surely, if you're not familiar with this dynamic, you can absolutely get torn down. And it's not going to be so easy to leave. It's like a drug addiction being in a trauma bond, just like it's addicting to be addicted to alcohol or opiates, etc. It's going to be really difficult to remove yourself from a toxic relationship like this, an abusive relationship. It's not nearly as easy as he's trying to make it seem.
Not my monkey, not my circus. They don't end up in 5-year relationships with the borderline. They don't end up married to the borderline for 20 years. At least not without assuming some accountability for the fact that they almost certainly were not healthy or securely attached when choosing to enter into and remain in.
So again, you can be healthy and sucked in, and then before you know it, it turns into a toxic situation. But he's saying, nope, if you're healthy, you'll be perfect and you'll just instantly be able to leave. Or if you're there, it means you have an attachment issue. I don't think so. I don't think it has as much to do with an attachment issue as it does being an abuse issue. I think that's more of a thing. But again, he's also doing a roundabout way to say, where is your accountability? It's like when someone just gets out of an abusive relationship, they'll say to them, oh, where is your responsibility? It takes two to tango, you know? And this guy, especially as a licensed professional, like you would think he would know better than to say some of this stuff. And you would think also he's had patients, clients that have been through this kind of thing. And to only imagine, this is what he said to them. I don't know. Doesn't make much sense to me.
Said relationship. So a borderline woman is much more likely to have unhealthy exes with attachment issues, like narcissists. Healthy, secure men do not stay with borderline women, and healthy, secure women do not stay with narcissistic men. What's more, because of the respective family ecosystems in which these disorders developed, we can understand borderline personality to be a way of dealing with narcissism and narcissistic personality to be a way of dealing with borderline.
No, I don't agree with that either. Again, for the genetic reason, and there's other things going on. There's other things going on. It is not just an adaptation or a defense to a borderline or a narcissist to become narcissistic or borderline. And again, the reason why we know this, because if that's all it took to be abused during childhood and to have childhood trauma, that's all it would take. Everyone would become a narcissist or a borderline, but they don't.
Put two and two together, and you can infer that it's more likely that a narcissistic man will get involved with a borderline woman compared to a non-borderline woman. And it's more likely that a borderline woman will get involved with a narcissistic man compared to non-narcissistic men. Again, this is because a non-narcissistic man will run out of a relationship with a borderline because it would just be too chaotic and intense. However,
and again, no understanding of what a trauma bond could be like. Ideally, people would just be, okay, I'm out. But when you're in a trauma bond, not always that easy.
A narcissistic man who is emotionally cut off and lacks empathy would be able to stay in the relationship far longer because he just wouldn't feel the emotional dynamic. By the same token, a non-borderline woman would run out of a relationship with a narcissist because it would just be too invalidating and neglectful. However, a borderline woman who is emotionally supercharged and behaviorally dysregulated would be able to stay in the relationship far longer because she would effortfully resist the emotional dynamic.
So, two things can be true at the same time. Borderlines may indeed like emotional volatility and ups and downs, sure. And they might like the dynamic with a narcissist because it plays into things they like. But just because a woman has been in a relationship with a narcissist, that doesn't mean they were more likely borderline. Oh, yeah, you must have been borderline to be in that. No, not always. There are other kinds of people that this happens to as well. It's not just borderlines, but it's also true that borderlines do sometimes gravitate to this dynamic. That's why there's books like The Narcissist and Borderline Couple. But again, he's explaining this in a very black and white way, kind of shallow, if you ask me. Oh.
Woman would run out of a relationship with a narcissist because it would just be too invalidating and neglectful. However, a borderline woman who is emotionally supercharged and behaviorally dysregulated would be able to stay in the relationship far longer because she would effortfully resist the emotional dynamic. It's like, who's going to win? The immovable object, the narcissist, or the irresistible force, the borderline? And the more immovable the object, the more irresistible the force, and vice versa. This is important to remember because these personality types exist on a continuum. Women with a few borderline traits are more likely to stay in relationships with men with a few narcissistic traits, and vice versa. And women with a lot.
I don't think that's what makes it more likely or not likely anyway. It can happen to anyone, regardless of their narcissistic or borderline traits.
Of borderline traits are more likely to stay in relationships with men with a lot of narcissistic traits, and vice versa. Now, one final word. It is hard to overstate how difficult and unstable relationships with folks with a personality disorder can be. They make soap operas look tame. And it's impossible to tell who has a personality disorder just by looking at them. So normal, secure people might date these types once and for a short period of time, but they certainly don't do it repeatedly over long periods of time.
So on one hand, I agree. Anyone can date one of these people once, but it doesn't always mean it's going to be a short amount of time, especially considering where that person is before they enter that relationship. How mature are they? What is their sense of self-worth? Are they afraid to be alone? Now, granted, yes, there are also unhealthy people who wind up with narcissists and borderlines as well, but it's not black and white. So just because you're in it doesn't automatically mean that there is automatically something very wrong with you. No, sometimes there are other variables going on. But where I will agree is if someone is consistently dating these kinds of people, then that is time to take a look at our side of the street, and we have to take a look at what we're doing, because if we're getting the same thing and expecting different results, we're doing the same thing expecting different results, that's the definition of insanity. And so we have to try to do something different if that's what we're doing. And I think it is important to say that, but to say it as, oh, where's your accountability, that kind of rhetoric, I've just never thought that was helpful. There is a time for that as well. There's a time for thinking about our side of the street. It is not instantly after you get out of these kinds of relationships. Timing is important. What I say to someone in stage one of healing is going to be much different than what I say to somebody in stage 2 or 3 of healing that is out of the relationship 6 months, a year, multiple years down the line.
So it's an even bigger red flag if the woman complains about multiple narcissistic exes, or she admits that she stayed with a narcissistic ex for a significant amount of time, as this is an indirect way of revealing some of her own psychological patterns that might make it very difficult to relate to her.
Now, one relationship that lasts a long time, I don't think that's as bad. If someone consistently attracts them, though, and that's like their pattern, I do agree that is more of an issue because they are the common denominator in those cases. But just once before you understand it, I think that's more understandable.
What do you think? Does this fit with your own experience? Let me know in the comments below. And please send this episode to someone who you think might benefit from its message. I know you know someone. You're thinking about that person right now who you want to send this to. It's word of mouth referrals like this that really help to make the channel grow. You want more content? This is what you can do. Go to my website.
All right. That's enough of that. So let's see some of the questions I got while I wasn't paying attention. Oh, so it's the woman's fault if her ex is a narcissist. Another example of blaming women for the failings of men. Yeah, it does sound like that's what he's doing. One of my videos has a glitch. Well, that's not very good. Is it the dog whistling video? Exact. That's a very good point there, Celeste. It's the frog in a boiling pot analogy of abuse. And for those who don't know what that is, if you were to put a frog in a boiling pot of water, they're going to jump right out. But if you put a frog in a pot of water and slowly turn up the heat, they boil to death. And that's the analogy of what a trauma bond is like. And that's kind of what Dr. Orion Taraban, he was not accounting for that in any way. And a narcissist can possibly be created by overindulgence and overly spoiling. I mean, that's what Sam Vaknin says. And I think there's mixed reviews on that aspect of it. I think the genetic piece is important. And I do think that environmental piece can contribute. I just don't think it can be the only cause, if that makes sense. But as far as Dr. Orion Taraban is concerned, I think he says some smart things, more so in the dating world to me, in other topics. But this video was fairly disappointing to me. I don't think that was his best showing. I've actually invited him on the show before, and now because of that video, now we would have a lot of good things to talk about, and I would give him some pushback on that. And I think if he were to talk to me, I would get him to a place where I think we would come to an understanding. But the way he's saying it in that video, just one-sided like that, I don't think that's the best way to put it. I don't think it's that helpful. And it's not as black and white as he's making it seem. But again, if someone's consistently attracting these kinds of people into their lives, that is something to take a look at. But I think before someone becomes aware of narcissists and borderlines, and especially when they're younger, when someone's young, they don't know what they don't know. If someone's in their late teens, early 20s, their frontal lobes in their brain are not fully developed yet. Especially back in the day, people would stay in relationships for decades with people that they met in their early 20s and late teens. That was just how it went back then. That was customary. And I don't think you could hold it against them. Oh, that one person was a narcissist, so that means they're just completely unhealthy. I think the relationship can make someone unhealthy. Absolutely. I think that's true. I think they can wear away at your sense of self esteem like sandpaper, and they can get you to develop CPTSD. But that's the aspects of this I just don't think he was mentioning at all. And I think it's an injustice. It's a disservice to not mention those things. But I think that's about it there for Dr. Orion Taraban. If you like it when I talk about this kind of stuff, I can do more of these breakdowns of other videos. It gives me a chance to talk to the people as well. Lately, as you've seen, I've just been doing more shorts and recorded videos. One of my next interviews is going to be Dr. Nadine, Dr. Nay, as she's called. She's the wife of the Wolf of Wall Street. Jordan Belfort is the Wolf of Wall Street. I'm going to be recording that interview with her, so that should be cool as well. But with that, thank you very much for watching, everyone. If you know someone that you think might benefit from my breakdown of this video, please share it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you like the video, please remember to like it. And also comment below what your thoughts are. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Have a good one.